How's everyone doing out there? My name is Andrae Bailey. I am the founder of an organization you may or may have not heard of, formerly known as Lead Homelessness. Sheriff, you might not even know this. We just renamed ourselves Rethinking Homelessness because we think that's appropriate for this topic. But I am the founder of an organization, Rethinking Homelessness, that is a resource on the issue of homelessness for leaders around America. We do webinars and other training tools for sheriffs, mayors, business leaders, faith leaders, continuums of care on the issue of homelessness. I work with the sheriff and with others on other issues as well, like the opioid crisis. But we've convened this webinar today to talk about how law enforcement can find solutions to panhandling and homelessness. What a turnout. Sheriff, we have over 450 law enforcement leaders from around America on this webinar today. People are hungry on this topic.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And Andrae, it's I appreciate you really bringing this to the law enforcement community. We know that the greatest responsibility that we have is to protect and preserve human life. And we know with crime and delinquency and other challenges that we face day in and day out, there are typically underlying conditions that are present that lead people down that path in the first place. And addressing it on that end keeps our community safe and increases the quality of life.
Gotcha. And so let me tell you guys, a lot of you are joining right now the webinar. Let me tell you a few of the ground rules and what we're covering today. Here's the topics of discussion: how law enforcement can effectively deal with panhandling. This is a big conversation. This is a tough conversation. Panhandling, encampments, people, sleeping in the streets, living in public spaces. It's a challenge that our society is struggling with, and law enforcement, I don't have to tell you guys, winds up having to deal with this problem where society has failed or is unable to do so. So we're going to get into panhandling. We've done some research here in our organization. Hasn't even been released publicly. It will be released publicly in about 2 weeks on panhandling. We're going to cover parts of that today. It's eye-opening. We're also going to cover just the bigger idea of public space management and how your ordinances, your laws, what can you legally do and not do in regard to panhandling and people sleeping in public spaces, living in public spaces. This is a tough conversation because there's a movement. In no way is this webinar meant to be political at all. That's not what we do. That's not who we are. But there's this cultural movement, guys, in America right now, where on one side, you've got folks who are pushing laws that are much less restrictive for people living in public spaces, panhandling, encampments. And we feel like, every community has the right to do what they want. Every state has the right to do what they want inside of the Constitution, inside of the laws of this country. But we feel like there's a lot of misconceptions out there right now on what law enforcement and leaders in communities can or cannot do. We're going to talk for a few minutes about that as well. And then just some best practices on law enforcement with homelessness. We're going to take Seminole County, Florida, which is right in the heart of Central Florida. Seminole County is like a nice 40-minute drive to Disney World. Is that probably
it?
It is.
Yeah, it's far enough away that you can still go with your family and enjoy it, but close enough to enjoy it, but far enough away where you don't have as many tourists there as the other communities. So,
right.
So we're going to cover that as well. Again, Sheriff Dennis Lemma. Dennis, how long have you been in law enforcement?
28 years.
28 years.
So it's all at the Seminole County Sheriff's Office, and I don't have to tell the law enforcement professionals out there. 28 years feels like 2 lifetimes in this business, so it's been a long time.
Seen a lot change in that time in regards to social issues as well, I'm sure.
Indeed, social issues. When we started back, 28 years ago, we weren't carrying medicine on our belt to bring people back to life. And what we find is with these social issues, homelessness and others, when the ball rolls between everyone's legs, it ends up in front of the law enforcement professional. And that's what we'll talk about today a little bit.
Yeah, we're not going to get deep into the opioid crisis in this webinar, but I will tell you our organization is going to schedule a big law enforcement webinar on the opioid crisis probably in January. Dennis Lemma is one of the national experts on the opioid crisis, so he's someone that you should keep on your radar if you're law enforcement for input. Chief Dan Purcell, Chief, how long have you been with Seminole County?
24 years. 24 years and a lifelong resident in Seminole County.
And if something goes wrong, if something goes right with homelessness, we call Dennis. If something goes wrong with homelessness in Seminole County, we call Dan.
Yeah,
And so Dan is on the front lines every day. One of his key jobs is helping that community manage homelessness. He works directly with the community's providers and others. And so he's going to talk about what they're doing as well. And I'm me. And if you need to get a hold of us, you'll find all of, there's a question box. If you have questions during the webinar, hit that chat box. We want to hear from you. I will warn you in advance, though, we got 60 questions last night, and we'll probably get another 100 during the webinar. We're going to try to answer a few questions, but we make a promise to you that we will reach out to you offline. Make sure you get all the answers if you don't get them in the webinar, and you can email us at info@rethinkinghomelessness.org. And so let me start by just saying this, that I think I don't have to tell you guys this, but I think it's a conversation that I'm having around America. Homelessness is really at a crossroads in this country, in communities across America, because, you guys have been around long enough to see all of the 10 years to end homelessness campaigns and all of the big, funding we put into things like Housing First, very important initiatives that were pushed down. And by the way, whatever your politics are, that's okay, because you've seen both bipartisan administrations in this country working on homelessness for really 15, 20 years. But I think most people that would agree that homelessness is really at a crossroads, because no matter how we choose to look at it, communities are still struggling, and maybe most communities are struggling worse than they've ever struggled. When we put out, so we do sheriff questionnaires, webinars and questionnaires for mayors. We had 127 mayors on a webinar a few weeks ago, and other groups. When we put questions out for law enforcement, we got back, Madison will tell you, a book from some of these folks. Like, here's 7 paragraphs of help us, we're struggling, and we don't know where to turn, and we are kind of, they feel alone in their community on this issue. So I think homelessness is how we deal with homelessness, how we solve it. We got to have some new, honest conversations about it, and that's what we're here to do today. And so we'll kind of dive right in and just talk about panhandling and how can you bring change on panhandling. So what are we even talking about here? When you talk about where law enforcement has to focus when it comes to panhandling, you really have to kind of break that down, because I think it's healthy to start by saying you're never going to end panhandling. You're never going to end homelessness, but you can create an environment where your community is managing it versus it manage you. And so when you break this issue down, I think you're really talking about, how does law enforcement focus on who's homeless on their street, homelessness, who has addiction, because you guys are seeing this, Sheriff, you see this as much as anyone else in law enforcement in America. Addiction is now driving a whole new group of people into the streets who wouldn't necessarily be homeless without addiction. Public spaces and crime. There are just some individuals who are committing crimes, and there's still an aspect of homelessness and those who are on the streets, all of it then feeding up to panhandling. So quick poll question for you guys. We're going to see how tech savvy law enforcement is, because my team is convinced that that poll questions are a good thing, and I do like it. What is the biggest challenge facing your community from a law enforcement standpoint? Chronic homelessness, people who have been homeless a very long time with disabilities. Addiction, people with methamphetamine, opioid addiction, alcoholism. Encampments in public spaces, homeless, crime, all the above or other. So fill out that poll question, and we're going to answer some of that in a minute. But let me make one big point here, and then we're going to hear from Sheriff and hear from Dan on some of the specific things they're doing in Seminole County. We wanted to bring Seminole County in because Seminole County is not a small community, but it's also not New York City. It's not Seattle. You guys have all the problems of a big city in a sense, most of them, and then you have the resources and challenges of a smaller community. So I thought they would be a great example. But this is my big idea I want to throw out to law enforcement leaders, and you guys are going to talk about this, how you do these two things in your community. So law enforcement must influence or implement all these solutions that you're going to hear about today. And understanding that principle is important. So what are we talking about, Sheriff? When we talk about implement, I'm going to ask you to back up just for 1 second. All right. So implement. You've got to implement common sense ordinances and laws on panhandling, aggressive panhandling, sit and lie, encampments, etc. You've got to have programs for diversion. If you arrest every person for every situation of homelessness, you would have no other officers. You have to divert people. You have to have best practices when it comes to addiction. You have to have internal training and education for law enforcement, public space management, and find solutions. But Sheriff, you've seen this, and you're a real leader on this in America. When it comes to homelessness, the opioid crisis, sometimes you've got to do jobs that really would seem to be reserved for mayors or county leaders or business leaders. Is it fair to say that if law enforcement isn't more proactive in working with the community beyond just their law enforcement agency, they're going to struggle on this issue?
There's no question. I mean, typically, and I don't need to share with the folks in law enforcement, is they turn to us for policy decisions, whether it's mayors or city councils or county commission. And there is some politics involved in this thing. A lot of people will talk and they'll be concerned about First Amendment rights and all of that. And they'll typically turn and say, well, what does the police chief or what does the sheriff think that we should do? What type of laws and ordinances should we create? And I think that your list is great there. And I know that you know this, Andrae. We talk quite a bit about this. Mental illness is another one that is high on that list. Sometimes co-occurring issues, but a lot of people who have this really persistent or later onset of mental illness results in the family then going to a 30-day program that is not sustainable for the family. And we see a lot of people turning to the streets because no one else would take them. I think that we can all agree that our system was never set up for our local jails and state prisons to be the place where homeless people go. Mm-hmm. It costs way too much money for that. And we have to address these with good policies and collaboration on the front end. And law enforcement is typically the ones that the ball rolls between everyone else's legs, and the ball ends up on the front door of the police department or the sheriff's office to kind of take this through. What we see with panhandling is there is a distinct difference that we all see between professional panhandlers and homeless people.
Yep.
And we can get into that, but that's a big deal.
And we will. I'm going to pitch it over to Dan for a minute. So again, Seminole County, located right in the north end of Central Florida. Central Florida, when it comes to a lot of issues, including homelessness, participates in a continuum of care. I'm sure most of you know what that is on homelessness. That looks like this: Orange, Osceola, and Seminole. Disney World's right down here, and downtown Orlando's here. They're in the north end of Central Florida, but they're seeing every single day folks with abuse issues, people on their streets and shelters, and they see this cycle here. Dan, talk a little bit about, I know we brought your report, talk a little bit about what homelessness looks like in Seminole County and what your job is every day to address it.
Sure, absolutely. So I think for perspective, it's important to look at the overall demographics of our county, our population, and the total geography of the county. Seminole County is about 315 square miles and has a population of about 475,000, give or take. With that, it really is the bedroom community of Orlando. Most of our county is a residential area. There are 7 municipalities in the county that generally have a local central area where many residents go for restaurants and public events and things of that nature. So with that, our homeless population in January during the point-in-time count was about 250 in January. Having said that, though, what we do in Seminole County in partnership with all 7 municipalities is every law enforcement officer is charged with documenting any type of contact with any homeless individual, including professional or homeless individuals that are panhandling.
Yeah,
So
pause 1 second. So just so you guys know, some of you out there, I think this is important. He's saying in this probably small sliver here, they found about 240-ish people in their point-in-time count, which we all know is usually a little low. But inside of the continuum of care, if you Google this, they're inside of a continuum of care that found like 2,000. So so he's not saying there's 200 homeless people in this geography.
Right.
He's saying about right here they found 200, and right here in the Central Florida continuum they found about 2,000.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And actually, the reality of that, Andrae, is that even in Seminole County, we've documented almost 450, 475 individuals year to date.
Gotcha.
And that's new context. That's not even repeat context. We're talking in the 1,500 to 2,000 range if you look at all the contexts. So we take an approach of documenting the individuals. We certainly provide services to them, and we have a lot of wraparound services, whether it's mental health, for drug addiction, including even a response on overdoses, which, by the way, even this year alone, 35 homeless individuals in Seminole County have overdosed and lived. So we have
through Narcan deployments.
That's correct.
Yep. So just again, I promise you this. We are going to stalk you out there in law enforcement for our webinar in January on law enforcement and the opioid crisis, because we're going to bring Sheriff Lemma back. But in this particular webinar, I will not allow myself or Sheriff Lemma to talk about opioids because it deserves, but it's something that is hot on our radar and should be on yours.
Right. I think the key to any strategy is, as both of you have mentioned, is a very strong collaboration with key community partners, private organizations, government organizations. You really can't survive without it. There's no strategy will survive unless there's a collaborative approach with all of the stakeholders in the area. And really, we're blessed in the Central Florida area to have many collaborative efforts, both in the county, in the cities, and of course across the region.
Gotcha. So you once a month, I'm assuming, maybe sometimes more frequently than that, sit with this guy and say, let me tell you what's going on with homelessness. Let me show you in a systematic way what we're doing. We have this report. We put it on the screen. We're going to send it to everyone out there. So don't worry. I will get you a copy of this. Walk us through, Dan, what this report is, not in detail.
Right.
What are you guys tracking from a data standpoint in Seminole County? And why is this important to sheriff and other community leaders? What you're tracking? What is this report, and what do you practically do with it?
So in our report management system, we call it CAFE, which is shared by all the municipalities and the sheriff's office as well. We document the individuals, and from that data, we track information like demographics. We look at mental health. We look at drug addiction. We look at the type of services that have been provided. We look at recidivism, incarceration, all those different things we track. In addition to that, we also track the location of the camps throughout the county. So any homeless camps that are located in the county, we document the location of them, the status of them, the owner of the property, the latitude, longitude, literally a litany of things. And so what this report does...
Real quick, page 9, when you guys get this, he's got a complete list. This is all public record, but he's got a complete list of where camps are. Now, mind you, this doesn't mean that they're able to go and remove all these camps necessarily, but they're going to keep track of where their citizens are and where these camps are in real time. I was very impressed with how you guys see part of the solution is data and just knowing where people are and knowing where camps are.
Well, let me add to this, because what is very, very unique about what we do is if the three of us were living in a camp, the circumstances behind why each one of us are in the camp are different and unique. Mm-hmm. And there is not enough resources to accommodate everybody who needs the help right now. So what we started was focusing on those people who are already at the mindset who don't want to live in a camp. Because we've run into people, law enforcement officers run into people who say, I choose to live like this.
Yeah.
I don't want to have permanent housing. I want to. So what we've done is we've gone out there and looked at, hey, I've got an aunt that lives in Nebraska. I would love to go back there. That's going to be stable for me. And then we work to try to get them on their back on their feet again.
Sheriff, real quick, just to give I can read your contemporaries' minds right now. How many law enforcement officers do you have in your division there in the Seminole County Sheriff's Office?
So we've got 1,400 members, and we have civil process servers, and we have child protective investigation. So it's not all sworn people do it. But we have 1,400 people.
How many sworn people do you think you have?
We have 500.
500 sworn. And then how many folks deal with just homelessness, as I know all of your officers do at some level, but do you have a team of people that are a little bit more putting this together?
Well, quite frankly, we don't really have a minimal team. We have the whole team.
Gotcha.
So we have about 175, 200 individuals, sworn individuals in our patrol, or what we call Seminole neighborhood policing.
You probably have a division that helped put this report together.
We have a crime analysis division
Okay.
that takes the data.
Gotcha.
The people dealing with it, I think this is an important point. The ownership has to be at the line level.
Gotcha.
It cannot just be one unit or one section. It needs to be an organizational adoption of a philosophy.
Yeah, I think what some people, this is where I'll go back to my question, was how would my law enforcement group out there organize ourselves to have similar data and a similar process to have their hands around homelessness?
And Andrae, look, in this business, we've done this wrong for many years. I mean, there was a time when I first started when we would move them to the county line and hope that they just walked away and never came back. There is still fear for some communities that if they put shelters in the communities, it's now going to attract people and they're going to be pushed back from businesses. So it's helping people overcome this impression of what goes on. It's our advocacy for that and creating programs that are sustainable and that works. And these numbers right here do not even represent the working poor.
Yeah.
The people who are living and sleeping in their cars, still going to work and school.
Yeah.
The people who are living on other people's couches. I mean, it's a big issue.
Yep. So I'm going to let Dan dive back into this a second, but here's really an important point for law enforcement leaders out there. What I was struck by in talking to Sheriff Lemma was how he pushes every day to, you're not going to solve homelessness. Ultimately, it's always going to be there at some level, but they have it organized internally inside of the sheriff's office to where they know what's happening. They know where these camps are. They know, if you look right here behind you, on the front of this report is, here's how many homeless individuals they encountered over the last month. And here's the different initial contacts they had. And the depth, we're going to send you this report, but the first lesson I would say that I learned from Seminole County's law enforcement is, if you don't have your data in order and you don't know who's homeless and why they're homeless, then ultimately you don't really have a fighting chance to continue making progress. Here's why. This is the infamous coordinated entry system that all of your nonprofit leaders, your county, your continuums of care talk about, where you're going to find people and encampments, do outreach, and then you're going to put them in this beautiful coordinated system. And then out the other side, they all are going to get shelter or housing. It doesn't really quite work this way in the real world. In the real world, the way this works is some people are going to get help. Some people, there are no resources to help them yet. But the way these arrows really should go is tiny arrows in and big arrows back out the other way.
Right.
I say that, though, because you have to have the data in law enforcement to push on the people. Law enforcement is never going to run this, almost never. You got to be able to go back to your continuum of care, to your homeless services network, your providers, and help them help those that are in your world. Is that a big part of how you use this data?
It is, and actually we shared that with some of our key stakeholders, including Homeless Services Network for the region.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sheriff, when you, I'll get off this report in just a second, but when you see a report like this come across your desk, you meet with your team once a month on homelessness, what are the big things that you want to see as a sheriff to see whether or not you're making progress?
I think we have to have the science behind us. We have to look at the metrics. We have to know when we walk into meetings with all of these stakeholders and collaborators that we can say, hey, here's the numbers, here's what's going on, and actually do something meaningful with what we see. I think the important takeaway here is it's easy to put the numbers together, but if we can find real solutions that are measurable with reductions and changing this process, we've made some great strides. But it's looking at that and knowing that those numbers are simply a snapshot of what we have. Each person that is represented by a number right there, the human element has to be involved in this thing. If executives only look at the numbers, a camp of 50 people is a lot different than 50 human beings that you talk to and realize, okay, I understand why he or she's homeless. It's because they have an alcohol problem, or their family abandoned them, or there's mental illness. It's those underlying conditions that are present that is the more difficult part, and it's what we're trying to track right now with summaries and documentation.
Yep, and if you are a law enforcement officer or a sheriff's department, city police, and you're able to take a report like this and walk in to your mayor's office, your county commissioner's office, your providers, and say, hey, here's what's really going on homelessness, you have much greater power to push on your community. The big theme of this webinar is there's no easy answer for law enforcement, but you can organize what you see in your community and lead upward and see big changes.
Well, and leading upward is important because, regardless of the numbers that you have in your document, I think that we all understand and recognize fixing broken windows. We know that community blight adds to other criminal activity and this kind of attitude of a free-for-all. Incivility within a community that goes unaddressed and untouched leads to more criminal acts. And we know that homelessness and all of those things that are associated with it kind of lead people in that direction.
Sheriff, I'll say it less eloquently than you just did. When my staff was asking me, Andre, what the hell are you going to tell law enforcement on how to fix this in America? I said, listen, fixing this is the wrong way of looking at it. It's kind of like if I were to say to you, is your car dirty, Dan, or is it not dirty? Think about a thought process behind what you would equate as my car is dirty or not dirty. Really, my car is dirty is the outside's not washed. I didn't take the trash out. I left my bag in there. I didn't vacuum it. It's 6, 8, 10 things that lead to, in a cumulative way, your car not being what you want it to be at that moment. If your car looks clean and you're like, I'll let Sheriff see my car. I got to give him a ride. It's because you washed the outside, you dressed the tires, you vacuumed it, you took your stuff out of it. Again, terrible example in one sense, but I think it's important for you as a law enforcement leader to realize, in my opinion, I've worked on homelessness 20 years. There is no easy answer to this.
No.
It's broken windows. It's every window at a time. It's one camp at a time. It's one person at a time that you are managing this towards where your community is in the best place it can be. Or what you see is one person at a time, you lose control of your streets until you're not managing homelessness, it's managing you.
And another problem that we see is if the law enforcement agency evolves to this level of acceptance where they no longer check out with the homeless people, meaning that there are people standing on the side of the road, we see them every single day, and you start to see marked patrol cars because of the demands and busy schedules just passing by, it indirectly gives a message that type of behavior is okay. And I think that we encourage all of our deputy sheriffs and the police officers within Seminole County to do as much as we can to check out these individuals, not only to help them, but they're a great resource to help us solve investigations, and they provide us with a lot of information daily.
We're going to send everyone out there this report from the Seminole County Sheriff's Office, and Dan, you might get a few questions on how you guys do this, and we're very open to that. Again, if you have a question, go to submit that right now in your chat box. But I want to pivot a second now to your panhandling ordinance, because this is a question that we've gotten from a lot of folks. This is probably the biggest question that law enforcement asks around America. What can we do legally in regards to panhandling, people sitting and lying in public spaces, aggressive panhandling, encampments? And these are questions that are being debated in the courts every single day. We're going to talk in a minute about 4 or 5 big court cases that are critically important for you to know about and your attorneys to know about. But here's a question we just got. It was actually, we put anonymous, although we do know who you are. Like many others, our community is struggling to develop a comprehensive strategy to house people who are homeless. We need more shelters. We see more encampments. What I loved about this question is how this was actually 3 paragraphs, and we had to get it down to fit on one slide. I love how my phone is ringing. Sorry, Sheriff, but I love how this question really encapsulates the complexity that law enforcement's looking at on this issue. Because if you have a simple solution to homelessness and panhandling in your sheriff's department, in your city, it's probably not going to work. You're going to have to look at all these areas and have your strategy on all those areas.
I mean, it's a great question, and quite literally, I was having a meeting about a greater level of partnership between law enforcement and the local shelters, because when you ask some people who are actually in the most need, Some of them are frightened to go into the shelters.
Yeah.
They think that there's a greater likelihood of victimization at the shelter than even out in their individual camp. So I think that it is in all of our best interest to find a way to partner with the various shelters that are available to make sure that it's just not a safe haven of people who are looking for a warm meal, but it's really an opportunity to have a one-stop shop to triage those conditions that are present, make people feel safe, and help them get on their feet. Local correctional facilities are going to want to partner with an organization like that.
Yep.
That again, that's safe. If it's not safe and there's a perception that they'll be victimized, nobody's leaving their camp to go there. We talk to some
Yep.
people, hey, go to the camp. No way.
Yeah.
They don't want to do that.
Yes, shelters might be great, and shelters might need improvement. Sometimes law enforcement has to weigh in on that. Sheriff, I'll let Dan talk about this as well. This is your ordinance that you guys have written. We're sending this to all of you. There, I have it printed out right here. You guys put a panhandling ordinance in place in January of 2015. Here's a copy of it in case you need it. You probably have it memorized. Tell me about what this ordinance, and by the way, I just want to say this and make this clear. Every community is going to create ordinances that work for them. That there's no cookie cutter, cut and paste way to solve your problem when it comes to ordinances and laws. We just want to show you one community, the thought process they had, and how they crafted that thought process into an ordinance for you to think about. And then I'm going to talk to you for just a minute about what we feel like certain court cases mean to why they can and cannot do this. Actually, when I heard Dan talk about this, I went, I think you guys didn't go far enough, in my opinion.
Well, we're always looking to expand it, and actually, we're looking at crash data in proximity to where people are asking for money.
Yes.
But I will tell you this: as soon as you go back to your agency and you talk about an ordinance, somebody inevitably is going to say to you, "What about the firefighters?
Yeah.
What about their boot drives and all
Yeah.
of this stuff?" I mean, it happens every time we talk about this, but
And they're going to say, what's the ACLU going to say?
there you go. But we're always looking to expand this. So we're right now we're gathering all of the crash data to make sure that we're looking at that. But Dan can talk about this.
Tell me about this ordinance and what you're trying to accomplish in 2015 to today with your panhandling ordinance.
So our Board of County Commissioner passed an aggressive panhandling statute back in 2015. This ordinance basically is designed so that if an individual impedes the flow of traffic, whether it's a vehicle or a pedestrian, if they step out into traffic, then they're in violation of the ordinance.
Okay.
Simply standing on the sidewalk or in the median of the highway is not enough in and of itself to constitute a violation.
In your ordinance.
Correct, but it also extends to public places. So if somebody's going into a retail establishment, a grocery store, anything like that, and they're indignant, they're rude, they're using profane language, they're surrounding somebody with two or more people that may be homeless or panhandling, that would be a violation. Frankly speaking, and I know that my brothers and sisters in law enforcement are seeing this, but there's a lot of First Amendment issues that surround this type of ordinance implementation. We've certainly seen it here locally in Florida. So there's a little bit of a conservative approach when it comes to these because, frankly, counties or organizations don't want to face any type of liability either.
Has anyone challenged you guys yet in courts on this?
We have not.
Okay, so
In the past 3 years, we've had 105 arrests on the panhandling ordinance.
Well,
and the cities have their own.
Which, by the way, when the arrest occurs from somebody who violates this, we then provide them very unique services on the inside of the correction facility. Because if we've got 2 or 3 or 5 days to work with them, we're going to try to address the homelessness issue while they're incarcerated. So it's just not arrest, that revolving door coming around. When we have them, we're going to try to fix whatever's broken.
That's right.
I don't know if you guys picked up on this, but he casually said something that I think is to be noted. Here's our ordinances, but oh, by the way, the city of Sanford and has their own ordinances. And one of the complexities of this issue with law enforcement around America is you can have an ordinance, but then your neighbor city and your county has different ordinances, and that can become very complicated. One of the things we urge you to do is to try to create collaboration amongst regional law enforcement on this issue, because of the fact that if you are operating under certain guidelines across the street is another jurisdiction where they're doing something else, there could be unintended consequences. Sheriff, but you're saying you have to look every day at your ordinances.
Every single day.
And say, is this working for us?
Every single day. I think that all of us in our jurisdictions, we get the complaints. It's the guy with the dog with water out there. It's the woman with the small child out there. It's the person on the bicycle that is taking those 7 people that are pulling their money together and renting a $400,000 house because they're more profitable standing on the corner working off the generosity. This is what we call professional panhandlers. They're not living homeless. They are making a great profit. And the very unfortunate thing is a lot of people believe that their intents are sincere.
Yep.
They feel good about themselves. They get the release of dopamine when they give $5 or some food or something like that. We always encourage people that if you want to help, there's ways to help in a more organized fashion. But those individuals will never leave that corner as long as it's profitable.
Yep.
It's why they don't stand in front of our residential home, because cars don't stop there. We won't make any money there.
Yep.
They stand right out there and then they feed off the generosity of the giving public.
The court cases that are important to you, I'm going to go through them really quickly. And by the way, you're going to get a copy of this as well. Federal case law on charitable solicitations. You guys, a lot of you out there know this way better than I do. But this is, I would tell you as an independent, I'm not an attorney. I'm just someone who wants to see solutions in communities. We've taken some pretty strong positions on these. The original court case, Schimberg versus Citizens for a Better Environment. This is the case law from 1980 that really set all of our charitable solicitations ordinances in America until about 2013, 2014, 15, where things began to change. It left a lot of open interpretation to what could be done. Then, as these officers know, the sheriff knows, Reed versus the town of Gilbert, huge court case in 2015, where in this court case, I'm not going to go through it in great detail. We're actually going to do that in a very a webinar soon in the near future. The church said, we're putting signs up and we don't have a permanent home. So we're putting signage up all over the place to tell people where we're having church. And they put different signs up with different messages at different times. The town of Gilbert, Arizona tried to put restrictions on that. It went all the way up, and ultimately Reed, the church was given permission by the courts to have signage. What they basically said is, if I have a sign and it has a message on it, it's the same thing as me telling the sheriff, hey, Sheriff, you look great today, or vote for Donald Trump, or vote for so-and-so. That this type of communication, this is what's important, protected under the Constitution. Law enforcement, I want to clarify this. You probably already know this, but I want to clarify this for you. It is our opinion that if you put in place ordinances that restrict panhandling, you will absolutely get shellacked by the courts every single time. You are going to lose in that situation. Now watch. Remember what we talked about earlier. I'm not talking about aggressive panhandling, where someone is a captive audience. I'm not talking about someone in the street, in a thoroughfare. I'm not talking about an encampment. But I would come back and just tell you, the courts have rested pretty clearly on panhandling. Just, hey, can I have $1? Or holding up a sign that says, help me, I need food. That is pretty decided in case law, and I don't see any chance of that being overturned. Some of you might not want to hear that. You might want to hear, oh, we're going to fight and we're going to be able to put ordinances in place that ban panhandling. Let's talk offline, because you are going to lose, and the ACLU will then rewrite all of your local ordinances in a courtroom. You guys have restrictions on that as well. You realize there's restrictions on enforcing that.
We do.
You know there's limitations.
And I'll tell you, if you have general counsels or your attorneys, your city attorneys, your county attorneys, you want to involve them in every step of the process before you try to implement anything like that at all. I mean,
a lot of them are on this right now.
We go back and forth and all that because you don't want to make a misstep on this thing. You don't want to lose it.
Yep. So, by the way, the poll question, our staff says, is it homelessness? Is it addiction? Is it encampments? The answer was all the above. You're dealing with all these issues. So thank you for answering that poll question. Now, this is maybe, I think, the most important thing I will tell you if you're law enforcement. If you arrest people and put ordinances in place for just general panhandling, you're going to get shellacked by the ACLU. They're going to beat you in court and beat you badly. You're going to lose every single time. Reed versus Town of Gilbert established that. But if you start looking at some of the court cases as they've evolved over the last few years, Thayer versus Worcester, and then you look at helping homeless versus the city of Tampa in 2016, we're going to get more in depth on these court cases in a different webinar because there's specific legalities I want to talk about. But here's the thing that I believe all law enforcement needs to hear. If you put ordinances in place that ban panhandling, you are going to lose in court. But if you put ordinances in place that restrict aggressive panhandling, people sitting and lying in public spaces, and encampments, the courts have not decided that that is something that you as a community cannot do. Now, Sheriff, there's half the audience right now is going, yes, but what about Martin v. Boise in 2018? So that's the big case that is absolutely out there and lingering. Martin v. Boise, as most of you know, if you don't know this, the most important court case for public space management, probably in modern American history, where, just summarizing it, the Boise tried to enforce ordinances they had, and they were told by the Ninth Circuit, you can't do that. You cannot restrict someone from living in public spaces because you have not given them adequate alternatives. So I've been in communities around America who right now, Sheriff, feel like they cannot take down an encampment or one person living in public space because of Martin v. Boise. I will tell you, Sheriff, if you're sitting next to law enforcement officers, if you're sitting next to your attorney, I completely disagree with them if they're telling you that. I just want you to know that. And if you look at, it's complicated. Now, point at them and say, he's not saying you're wrong. He's just saying it's more complicated. Panhandling is something protected clearly by the courts. But I think encampments is what communities like Seminole County, what communities on the West Coast and East Coast of this country and right down the middle need to be thinking about. Know this, that encampments are complicated, but if you allow people to start living in public spaces, especially new people on sidewalks or in places that are in public, the longer those people are there, the longer they're going to be protected to remove those encampments. You guys were saying you see this in Seminole County all the time. You understand the nuances there.
We do.
Dan, talk a little bit about what you guys kind of see every day when it comes to encampments.
You know, fortunately for us, we don't have a lot of public encampments. Most of ours are on private property, so we're able to work with the landowners, typically private property or even some state property. And we're able to work with them to get trespass letters, relocate the individuals, get them into services, things of that nature, and even put fencing up and clean up the area and so forth. So we've had a lot of great success in that regard. But, frankly, it comes down to just simple police 101 and problem solving.
Yep. Important, though, to know, Seminole County, they would tell you, they realize they're different than even in their own continuum of care. Downtown Sanford, downtown city of Orlando, where there might be people on sidewalks trying to sleep or live.
I think an important part to mention that we haven't talked about yet is like veteran stand down and services specifically for our veterans population and all that. I think that when we come up with a holistic strategy to address this, if you can pull out certain segments of that homeless population and provide very, very unique services facilitated by people that they trust and that they're familiar with, it goes a long way. We just had a veteran stand down in the county a couple of weeks ago, and it's always has a wonderful, wonderful success. But inevitably, there'll be people within each one of our agencies that try to move them along. They'll pull up to an intersection. They'll get on their PA microphone and say, you can't hang out here. And they will fold up their sign. They will shove it in their pants and they'll start walking away. And they're just moving it. The only way we fix this thing is by checking out, talking, and providing some holistic, well-rounded services with other stakeholders.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue. By the way, we're going to get in depth in a future webinar with a city that has a lot more of city-centered issues. Some of you are rural out there, a lot of you rural. Some of you have cities that have people living in public spaces. We'll give you a good friend of all of ours, Chief of Police Orlando Roulon, is going to talk more about how these laws have to be implemented when you have more people living in public spaces on sidewalks.
Right.
But most of you are dealing with both of those, so we wanted to focus on both of those in some of the training we're doing. But this is a great segue. I want to say this one more time though, because I want to be clear. You need to make the decisions that are right for your community. This represents, at the moment, this ordinance that Seminole County put in place in 2015. It represents what's right for them after looking at all of the case law and all of what their community looks like. Nobody can tell you what that looks like in your community. But here's where I caution you though. If you have people in your sheriff, law enforcement, chief of police out there, if you have people telling you that the Martin v. Boise case and other cases now have completely, forgive the pun, handcuffed you to not be able to move encampments, or you have to have a free-for-all on your streets, that's absolutely false. And we want to push back on that, because when the Martin case is overturned, which, by the way, the Supreme Court, if you look at the Ninth Circuit, no politics here, one of the most liberal courts in America, that case is getting overturned. And so, but if you've allowed all these new encampments, now you actually have a different burden of proof, because those people have lived in your community on the streets. So panhandling, protected underneath the First Amendment. Encampments, I would tell you, I do not believe they're protected even under Martin v. Boise, but we'll get into that more later. Again, in the last 15 minutes, we've thrown a lot at you. Keep giving us questions. Anonymous question again, panhandling is becoming a profession for many. Many panhandlers are turning down job opportunities to pursue lucrative panhandling opportunities, and they're out on the roads. What are we going to do? I think the sheriff, thanks for this question, I think the sheriff addressed this. Maybe he meant to or didn't mean to, but he addressed this a minute ago, where he said, really, you need to know who's on your streets.
I was going to go one step further than that.
Okay.
I quite literally was going to put a deputy sheriff on the opposite corner with holding a sign that says the people on the other side are not actually homeless, that they're pulling their money and they're renting a $300,000 house down the street.
Yeah.
I mean, because there is a learning curve, because, the altruism of citizens in society see that and they say, my goodness, there's this puppy out here. They are literally charging their cell phones behind the corner. And this professional panhandling is something that a lot of our citizens have not yet heard about.
Yep.
They think if you're asking for money, you're in dire situations. I think that we have to do whatever we can through our social media, our marketing campaigns, to let people know that there is a distinct difference.
So watch this. This report, I'll unpack that just a second. He's saying this report, which tells him really every day who's homeless on the streets of Seminole County, allows him and his officers to not use blanket judgments, but to know, oh, that's Larry. And we know Larry. And Larry's standing next to Susie. Susie's a veteran who served in the Gulf War, who has PTSD. She's struggling physically. We're going to get her help. Larry needs to be moved along and needs, at the best of our ability, legally, but ultimately the community should know that Susie needs help and Larry needs, hopefully, to find something else to do. But only data tells you that.
And it's the decision that people that are in the camps making. I talked to somebody just a couple of weeks ago, and I said, do you know how much money it would cost to constantly be intoxicated? I mean, if you were not drinking water or soda, but if you were drinking around the clock liquor, it takes a lot of money to remain constantly intoxicated. And that's what's happening with a lot of these folks. They keep getting money, and every single bit of their money is not going to food or other things, it's going to liquor. So it's addressing those conditions that we know that the alcohol addiction is a big part of homelessness.
So let's unpack that just a second. So I'm going to show you folks a snapshot of a panhandling study that our organization, Rethinking Homelessness, has just completed. It's a year-long study, and we've got some results. They're telling us to back up a little bit. Some results I want you to see, and I want you to take these results through the lens of what the sheriff just said, which is this. You got to know who's on your streets, and some people need a lot of help, and we need to navigate those people to help, and other people need to be diverted to some different choices and other forms of help.
But when you start, sometimes you take a whole encampment and you say, start. If there's 10 people there, say, do you want help? Do you want help? Do you want help? If there's 5 that say that they want help, let's start with those 5 that are already convinced.
One person at a time. So let me show you this panhandling study we did. Let me preface this before I unpack it, that we went into a big city. We went into the city of Orlando without telling them, of course, because any study to be done accurately needs to be done anonymously. And we studied panhandling in a big city, in a city environment. We had observers who were out looking at those who were panhandling, and we found a cohort of people who were panhandling the most. We created a cohort of 63 people, and this is some interesting data. We're going to get into this more at a later webinar, but this is incredibly interesting for those who are chronically panhandling. Very few military veterans actually left out on the streets. If you see a lot of signage that says, "Hey, I'm a veteran," I will tell you that's most likely not true. The programs that our local communities have done on homelessness for veterans have been pretty effective. And you've seen a lot of veterans come off the street, so very few veterans, only a handful of women. With this group of people, I think I should say this. They might not be able to say it. I'll say it. I see homeless individuals in cities are often different than they are in rural or in more county areas. Now, is there a big mixture where at times it's all kinds of different folks? Yes. But I think that the most mentally ill, disabled individuals actually wind up in cities. That a lot of them are out in encampments as well. They wind up in encampments way out in the woods, or they wind up sleeping under buildings in cities. That's what we found. So we found a lot of them have drug issues, and a lot of them are, in our study, were actually homeless. The professional panhandlers, it's funny, not funny, but it's interesting. The professional panhandlers usually panhandle in intersections that are busy, and a lot of the more mentally ill individuals will, they're not even of the capacity to think through those decisions. Right. Let me skip ahead. This is fascinating. Of the chronic panhandlers, the ones that were panhandling absolutely the most, there was this intersection of these 3 conditions: drug use and addiction. And I don't want to be judgmental here, because a lot of these folks need help, not judgment. But people are panhandling without question to buy drugs and alcohol. So whether or not whether we deem them deserving of help, that's a very philosophical question. I would tell you either way, though, virtually every person in our study was using money to buy drugs and alcohol. Huge correlation with mental illness and a lot of the folks that have been homeless the longest. And so that I think that has to be taken into consideration. And then just a lot of them were homeless. This group of individuals, less of the professional panhandlers, we found those people more in the county. Those people are more in the counties, and they're smart people who know exactly what intersection to stand on. And we talked about the mental illness and the substance abuse circle as well. Just one last thing to think about. The majority of the panhandling is going to happen between 2 groups of people: professional panhandlers and, that's the sheriff calling me again, professional panhandlers and folks with severe mental illness. Just one little common sense tip to law enforcement out there. You need to use your data and your information tools to be able to know if you see people out there panhandling all the time. Hey guys, is that person a professional panhandler? Meaning really they panhandle for a living and they're not homeless. Or is that person severely mentally ill? Because they're going to be one or the other of those 2. You got to have data to know that. The people that are severely mentally ill, they need to be navigated to help, to get housing, and have a community strategy that does that. And we need to divert those who are professional panhandlers. In our last 5 minutes, I want to just come back to something the sheriff had talked about earlier, and we had talked to this team from Seminole County earlier, that it's going to take often law enforcement. Here's the one, actually, I'm going to give you 2 messages, 2 big messages here. Message number 1, don't allow encampments. You're crazy if you allow encampments. And if you let your city attorney, your sheriff's attorney, If they tell you to allow encampments, I promise you, you will remember I said this and you're going to regret it. You can't go and just knock them all down and drag people out. You cannot do that. But every tent you put out there and allow, especially in your public spaces, is a tent that you will have to legally pry off that sidewalk one day. You gotta know that panhandling is protected. Encampments, you need to be diligent to not allow new tents in your community. Number one. Number two, you're going to have to expand beyond law enforcement and bring your community together to address this. Sheriff says it very eloquently. The ball rolls between everyone's legs and you wind up, you got to roll it back. You got to bring together government leaders, business leaders, people who fund in philanthropy, healthcare, nonprofits, education, faith-based organizations. Sometimes law enforcement has to lead on an issue that really other people should lead on. But Sheriff, sometimes if you don't do it, nobody's coming.
Well, I think that when we do it as sheriffs and chiefs of police, people trust us. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't look political. It doesn't look like they're advocating. And quite frankly, we have been known to take some bold steps to advocate for the citizens that we serve day in and day out. Some people simply won't do it. If there's anybody that's going to connect the dots of all of these players, it's going to be us.
Yep, and we have some tools we can send you on how to bring your community together. But I think Sheriff Lemma is a great example of kind of the tactics you need to use. But law enforcement, if you're waiting, if you're a basketball fan, I remember when Rick Pitino coached the Boston Celtics after Larry Bird and Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale had all retired. And they had that next team of people, and they were getting their butts kicked every game. And he said to reporters after one butt kicking, he said, "Hey, listen, Larry Bird's not walking through that door. Robert Parrish isn't walking through that door. If you're waiting for your solution to come from other parts of your community, it might be that you have to find a way to keep your job. Don't get fired. I'm not saying go out there and make decisions that get you in a bunch of trouble overnight, but you might have to find a leadership role that is proactive and not reactive."
And there's still some people who are in our occupation that feel like, hey, you know what? That's social work. That's a bunch of tree hugging stuff, and it's not our responsibility. Nobody would bring into question that all of this has a direct correlation to crime and the fear of crime and the quality of life of our citizens. Yeah, there's a direct correlation.
If you go into, I go around America visiting communities, and when you go into a community, the saddest part is I've been to communities, guys, where they actually care a lot about people who are on the streets, who are homeless, but they've lost control of their public space, and what their citizens, their business leaders, what everyone interprets is they don't care, and that they're okay with crime.
And then when you lose control, that's a whole different strategy to regain control than if you stay on top of it in the first place. Yep. It's the broken windows.
That's the big message here is you're going to have to be proactive, probably have a leadership role that's very out front, and you're going to have to, one person at a time and one leadership group at a time, get control back of your streets if no one else is doing it. Again, we have literally had over 100 questions, and we're going to get back to you and answer them. We don't want to neglect your questions, but this webinar is meant to give you an overview of some big ideas. We're going to answer a lot of your questions later on offline. We're also going to address some of your questions on the webinar we're doing December 5th, of more city-related and law. We're going to dive into the laws. We're going to dive into Martin v. Boise, because I know some city attorneys out there and some, what do you call a sheriff's attorney?
General counsel.
General counsel are I can hear you out there telling your chief of police or your sheriff that what I said isn't true. Or we're going to have a very healthy debate on that. If you allow encampments, new tents in your community, especially in public spaces, you will regret that you're doing that. Does anything tell you that you've lost control more than giving up your public space?
No, and especially these police chiefs and sheriffs. I mean, what we do is take risks. We can't be so afraid of civil litigation that we don't do what's right. Counsel the attorneys and do that, but you know what? There's always a second opinion on the majority of these things that are going on. So we've got to do it.
And I didn't do it in this particular meeting. We're going to wrap up in the next 60, 90 seconds. So don't worry, we're going to wrap up on time. But there's a big movement. I'm going to show you guys. I got a PowerPoint sent to me a few weeks ago from the plenary session, the main session at the big homeless conference in America. 3,000 leaders from around America whose job it is to fix homelessness, not law enforcement. They allowed the plenary session to be from a group, I won't name their name, but who said to all these community leaders, the answer is more encampments. Let people camp, and that's the answer.
It does not fix problems at all. And I'll tell you, I know you'll get into it in another section, but there is that cross section where mental illness, substance abuse, and if we don't connect these dots, it will continue to grow across this country.
Yep, as we go, I will remind you that we're going to talk about in our next meeting as well, cities that are making progress. Housing first is important. We didn't talk about it much here. I hate the pushback I hear right now on housing first. If you haven't seen it, the Trump administration did a brief on homelessness after visiting Los Angeles probably about 8 weeks ago. We're in constant communication with national, state leaders. I think that a lot of the advocates for housing first have done a disservice to housing first because it actually works. If you take people who are veterans, if you have someone with mental illness, you should not be arresting them. Your community should be providing them with permanent supportive housing. But the problem is we've done that very poorly, and leaders have done it poorly across America. And while we've done that at some level successfully, where we've done it successfully, we've also let, like in some of these cities, hundreds, if not thousands of people live in public spaces. So it's completely undermined all the good work that's happening. So we're going to talk about that in the next webinar as well. Don't forget, December 5th, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m., sign up for that webinar. And we're just thankful. We're thankful that you attended. And you don't get enough thanks. Law enforcement gets a kick in the ass every time anything goes wrong, and they don't get told enough that they're doing a good job. Thank you. The fact that you signed up for this webinar is testament to the fact that you care about your community and that you're trying to make solutions happen for those who are homeless and for your citizens. So thank you for that. Thank you to the Seminole County team here, Sheriff Lemma, Dan, you guys are amazing. Keep up the good work. If people will be sending you some of their information as well, we're going to send you Dennis's cell phone number. Just call him after the webinar. He's available. But no, he's available. Dan's available. We want to help you. And one last thing, we will be getting you information on a national webinar for law enforcement on the opioid crisis. Probably late January, we'll do that. Sheriff Lemma, I think, is the law enforcement, one of the law enforcement leaders in America on what law enforcement should be doing on the opioid crisis, the distribution of Narcan, and again, leading your community sometimes into new solutions. Thank you guys for attending, and we'll talk to you very soon.